Hi, I'm Margaret Holzmann, helping you express your colorful side through knitting. Welcome to this Design and Knit project. We will be designing the crisscross block and then we'll be knitting it. This is a long video, but I decided to put everything in a single video to make it easy to find. Here are a few ways that you can color your block. The first one is called Oregon Trail. On the right is blue ochre. These next two suggest flowers. The one on the left is daffodil and iris, and on the right is night blooms. If you would like to choose your own colors, you can experiment with them by downloading my coloring page from the webpage associated with this project. First, we're going to start by designing the block. I'll show you about the shapes, their sizes, and how they translate into knitting. And then we'll be knitting the block together. The first part of the block is the 5 small squares that are in the center. I've thought of 2 different methods for knitting the cross. Let's look at them now. This is a line drawing of our block. These dashed lines show that the outer shapes of the block are actually a 3x3 grid. The cross type shape in the middle is also a 3x3 grid, but it's been rotated to fit into the larger square. Let's remove those 4 blue squares and then we get our block. One of the first things we have to do is figure out what size this block is going to be in stitches. I have another project on the go that is using 50 stitch blocks, and it would be great if this block could be interchanged with those blocks. 51 stitches is divisible by 3 and is close to 50. Since these 3 edges are equal length, we'll just divide by 3 and then we get 17 stitches per edge. In my other project, the blocks are coming out to be about 10.5 inches or 27 centimeters. Let's take a closer look at these 2 shapes. We know a couple things about them already, that 17 stitches is the length of an edge for the outer shape. What we don't know is the number of stitches on an edge for the small square that's part of the cross. Let's simplify these shapes a little bit more, and then we can figure out how many stitches we need for this edge. I'll bisect the edge with a line at 45 degrees from the horizontal. 17 stitches divided by 2 is 8.5 stitches. Let's bring back the small square. This is what we know already, and it's actually enough to calculate AC. We know that this is a right triangle and that we can get the hypotenuse by multiplying one of the shorter edges by the square root of 2. We'll express that in stitches. 1.41 times 8.5 stitches is 12 stitches, which is a nice round number. We now have the length of the small square edge in stitches or rows. Remember that in garter stitch, the number of rows is 2 times the number of stitches. Let's rotate this block by 45 degrees and highlight the cross. We're going to work that cross first. Here are some symbols used in the construction diagrams that you'll see. And here are some knitting abbreviations and their definitions. I can think of 2 methods for knitting the cross. This is method 1. We'll start by casting on 12 stitches, and then we're going to knit 23 rows. And then we'll cut off our yarn, which is the color A. We'll continue by knitting 24 rows in color B, and then we'll cut off that yarn. And then we will knit 24 more rows in color A, and then we'll place those 12 stitches on a holder. Starting at the red triangle, we will pick up and knit 12 stitches, 1 per garter stitch ridge, and then knit 23 rows and place those stitches on a holder and cut the yarn. On the opposite side, starting at the green triangle, we will pick up 12 stitches and knit 23 rows, and then place those stitches on a holder and cut the yarn. Now we have finished the cross for method 1. A pro of this method is that it's very easy to understand, but we have also generated 10 ends that we now need to weave in. That's not so good. I wonder if there's a way to take advantage of the 4 squares all worked in A in order to reduce the number of ends generated. That brings us to method 2. In method 2, using color A, we cast on 12 stitches, then knit 22 rows and bind off 11 stitches, leaving 1 stitch on the needle. We turn the needle and cast on 11 stitches so that we're back to 12 stitches, and then knit 22 rows. And then we just repeat that, binding off 11 stitches, casting on 11, knitting 22 rows, and then again binding off 11 stitches, casting on 11 stitches, knitting 22 rows, and finally binding off all 12 stitches after completing the 4th square. This does only generate 2 ends, which is good, but I'm wondering whether it's actually harder to explain. I wonder whether a knitter can immediately see that the 4 squares they've knitted can be reoriented into this cross-like shape. I also am thinking about whether there are some techniques that will be used that are not popular. Some knitters really don't like sewing. Let's continue looking at method 2 to see how we're going to work the center. Starting with color B, at the red triangle, pick up and knit 12 stitches along the edge of the first square, 1 per garter stitch ridge. Then place a marker, and then repeat, picking up 12 stitches along the next edge, placing a marker, then 12 stitches along the next edge, placing another marker, and then 12 stitches to the end of the last square. We'll work towards the center, making decreases on right side rows, 1 decrease on each end, and paired decreases around each marker, for a total of 8 stitches reduced per right side row. Eventually, as we approach the center, we'll just have 8 stitches left, and then we can thread the yarn end onto a tapestry needle and insert it through the stitches. We do have this small seam that needs to be sewn with mattress stitch, so that's not great, but it is just a small seam. Now we've explored the 2 methods that I came up with for making the 2 crosses. Maybe you can think of some other ways. Next, we're going to design the outer shapes for the block. We're now ready to work the corners and the houses, shown here. The corners are worked in color C and the houses in color D. We're going to work these so that we're joining them directly to the cross as they're worked so that we don't have to sew them later. We can work either the corners, then the houses, or vice versa. I think it's going to be easy to work the corners first, and we can start with the live stitches. We'll transfer the live stitches at the end of each small square to a needle and then work towards the corner. For the houses, we'll pick up and knit stitches around the edges of the existing pieces and then work towards the center. And as you will recall, the edges of a cross are 12 stitches and the edges of outer squares are 17 stitches. The diagonal, shown here as a blue dashed line, is 17 times the square root of 2. That is 24 stitches. We'll start with the 12 stitches and then we'll adjust to 14 stitches on the first wrong side row, increase each end of right side rows until we get to 24 stitches, then we'll be decreasing on both ends of right side rows until 2 stitches remain, and then the next row will be a knit 2 together. For houses, recall that the cross edges are each 12 stitches, the edges of the outer squares 17 stitches, and then the short edge is 17 divided by 2, which is 8.5 stitches. We can round that down to 8. Now, I promised you earlier that we would be designing a more complex shape, and this is it. The little squares shown here are 1 stitch wide and 2 rows high, so they represent 1 stitch in a ridge. There is a marker placed between each edge's stitches. I'm also showing the starting stitch counts around each edge. The pink edge has 11 stitches instead of 12, so that the CDD, a central double decrease that we're going to work there, will be centered at M2. M2 is always placed after the worked CDD on right side rows. M2 needs a CDD to avoid a leggy looking line of stitches that is caused by working paired decreases on every ridge. I try to avoid that by using a CDD instead. The decreases around M1 and M3 can be paired because they're not worked on every ridge. Stitches belonging to each edge are colored differently. The pick up and knit is counted as row 1, and row 2 is a plain knit row. These numbers are the total stitch count after working this ridge, and in the round braces, the number of stitches between pairs of markers from a right side perspective. The dashes represent, in order, markers 1, 2, and 3 respectively. So this reads as 8 stitches from the beginning of the row to M1, 12 stitches between M1 and M2, 11 stitches between M2 and M3, and 8 stitches from M3 to the end of the row. On ridge 2, which is rows 3 and 4, we will work a CDD around marker 2, and all wrong side rows are knit. Those overlapping little squares at M1 and M3 indicate that we have to make a decrease soon. Ridge 3 is rows 5 and 6, and we work a paired SSK knit 2 together around markers 1 and marker 3, and then a CDD at M2, for a total of 6 stitches decreased. We repeat rows 3 and 5 2 more times to make ridges 4 through 7. For ridges 8 and 9, we repeat row 3 twice, creating 2 more ridges. Now we can remove the markers, and we do a setup for the 3 needle bind off by knitting to the center of the row, knit 5, knit 2 together. The knit 2 together decreases by 1 stitch, so we now have an even number of stitches. We turn needles with tips parallel and right sides together and 3 needle bind off all remaining stitches. Cut yarn and insert the end through the remaining loop on the needle. Now make houses in the other house-shaped openings. We've now designed the cross or the small squares and the outer shapes for the block. So let's gather up our supplies now and we can start knitting. These are the yarn requirements that you're going to need for the entire block. You'll also see the needles, desired gauge, and other notions that you're going to need. The block diagram identifies which colors are used in which areas of the block. These yarn amounts assume that you're working in a worsted medium weight yarn at a gauge of somewhere between 17 and 19 stitches per 4 inches or 10 centimeters. I recommend using a fuzzy type fiber such as acrylic wool or alpaca, or a blend of those, rather than a smooth yarn. If you want to use a smooth yarn, make sure that the blend is at least 50% of the fuzzy type fibers so that holes don't show in your work. I've got 2 colors. I'm going to use this light green for my color A, and I'm going to use this orange for my color B. That's for the center. This is for the outer small squares. So I'm going to start with my A color. I'm going to make a slip knot, cross, put the working end through, slide it through the needle, pull to tighten, and I'm going to cast on 12 stitches using a knitted cast on. So the knitted cast on, I insert knitwise, so that's left to right through the front leg, yarn around the right needle, pull a loop through, and I'm twisting a little and placing it on the needle. Repeat that. So I want 12 stitches total. I use a knitted cast on because it's equal in height to 1 row of knitting and garter stitch. It's also a cast on that people my age were taught when they learned how to knit. if you learned how to knit recently, you probably were taught either this or a long tail cast on, which has also become very popular. Two, 4, 6, 8, 10. I need 2 more. Stitch 11, stitch 12. Okay. And now we do just 23 rows of knitting, plain knitting. Okay, so I know that I'm on a right side row because my cast on tail using a knitted cast on is hanging off on the right. If you used a long tail cast on, which you shouldn't for this pattern, it would be hanging off the left. So make sure you use a knitted cast on. And so then I can count 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Okay? And so now I can add my color B for the center. So I'm going to use this orange, and let me cut my yarn off here. When I start knitting with a new color, I don't tie it on, and that's because I use duplicate stitch weaving on the wrong side, and that secures the yarn. The friction of that is going to secure the yarn permanently. So no need to tie on. So I just clamp it. I clamp the yarn to start between my index and third finger, just to give it some tension, and then I start knitting. So now we're going to, according to the directions in that blue box for step 2, which is the center block, we're going to knit 24 rows, continuing on these same 12 stitches. Okay, so just another count here. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Okay, so I've got that done, and I can cut off my B yarn. I'm going to leave about 6 inches for weaving. And now I'm going to go back to the A yarn and knit another 24 rows. Okay. So there we go. We got square 1, square 2, square 3. Let's just recount this. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. I'm looking at the right side. I've got all the tails on the right side, which is proper. And the last row that I knitted, the working yarn is hanging off the right side. So I know that I finished my last wrong side row, and now I can cut this yarn, leaving about 6 inches for weaving in, and I'll just grab a little piece of this yarn and my scissors. We'll just make a piece of scrap yarn. I'll thread it onto a regular tapestry needle and insert it through each of the stitches that are still on the needle. Can just tie a little bow just to stop them from falling off. Okay, so now we're ready to do square 4. So we've got the yarns hanging off to the right. I'm going to rotate it clockwise. So now I'm looking at the left edge of square number 2. And I'm going to be picking up 12 stitches, 1 per garter stitch ridge along this square 2, which is for me this orange color. So I'm going to start by working on the right side. When I pick up a knit, I always work on the right-hand side. And I'm going to identify the ridges. So the ridges are these prominent surface features. And I'm going to run my needle along to the end of the first ridge. And I notice that I have kind of like a little knot at the end. And I hope that my camera, if I get up close, will focus properly. So I can put my needle in there and stretch it out so I can see that hole better. It's right there. And there's actually 2 little yarns that are there that are kind of twisted. So there's the hole. And again, if I look at other ridges, they have the same thing, right? They have that kind of little bump or knot at the end that I can stick a needle through and stretch it out and make it bigger. That's what I want to stick my needle through. So I'm just pulling each of them out so they're visible. Let's wait for my camera to get in focus again. It's not very helpful when it's constantly refocusing like that. Okay. So you can pick up a knit with a crochet hook. I like to do it with a knitting needle. And so I'm going to get my A yarn and I'm going to clamp it between my middle finger and my index finger of my left hand and leaving about 6 inches of an end for weaving in. I'm going to yarn around the right needle and pull a loop through. I want the tension to be about the same as regular knitting. So now I've got the first one through, 1 stitch on the needle. I'm going to insert in the next ridge through that knot at the end, yarn around, pull a loop through. And there's my 3rd ridge right there. So I'm going to open up my little knot at the end, stick my needle through it, yarn around, and pull a loop through. I've got my yarn tensioned on my right hand just like I normally do. So 4th ridge, again, open up so you can see the little hole. Stick my needle through, pull a yarn through. 5th ridge, same thing. Now, some people like to pick up in this strand that's between the ridges, like this, like that. I don't do that because this is geometric knitting and I would get 1 stitch fewer than I need if I went through the legs instead of the ridges, because there's only 11 spaces between ridges and I need 12 stitches. And the other reason is that I like to go through. Okay, camera, calm down and get in focus. Okay, I like to go through the 2 strands because when this knitting or this join right here is under stress or tension and there's just 1 stitch, it could pull out, right? And it won't look as good. I like the firmness of 2 strands. I'm going to go through and just continue picking up and knitting along here. 1 stitch per ridge. Oops, also got a little strand there. That happens. This should be number 11. The last stitch, right where there's a color join, looks like there's kind of like both colors going on. You can see like the little bit of green there and then orange. Once I pick up a knit through that, that little bit of green just flips to the back so you don't see it anymore. It neatens that up. So before I continue, I'm gonna count. So then I turn, and there's what my pick up and knit looks like just after I did it. And now I am going to knit 23 rows. Like the cast on, a pick up and knit counts as run 1 row, and it's a right side row. Pick up and knits and cast on are, in my world, right side rows. And so now I just need to knit a whole bunch of rows. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Perfect. Okay. Let's just review why I know that I'm done. So I said that the pick up and knit counted as row 1, and then I knitted 23 more rows. And I know that I'm done because I've got 12 ridges, the last ridge being right underneath the needle, kind of attached to the needle. And I know that I just finished a wrong side row, row number 23, because this working yarn is hanging off on the end, and I'm going to cut it, leaving about 6 inches for weaving. Okay, and then I'm going to get a tapestry needle and create some more scrap yarn for myself. Just cut, I'm going to leave a little bit longer piece this time so I actually have enough to tie a proper bow. And then I can just insert my needle through all of these stitches, get them off onto the tapestry needle. Pull that through. Tie it. Okay. So now the orientation of this piece is like this, right? So because I started, that's my cast on down there. So this is square 1, square 2, square 3, square 4, and now starting in my neutral, up position, I can turn it counterclockwise 90 degrees. And now I'm going to pick up and knit for square 5 on this edge, just doing the same thing that I did before. I'm going to identify the ridge, the first ridge, find the stitch way at the end and open up that little knot, which is really 2 stitches. And getting my A yarn again, leaving a 6-inch-ish tail for weaving in, about that much maybe. Can yarn around and pull my first stitch through. Okay. Let me bring it up closer. Hopefully we stay in focus. So then I insert through the next bump or ridge, opening up that knotty thing there. It's very knotty. And then ridge 3, the same thing. Keeping my tension similar to the knitting. I think I'm kind of a loose knitter. In the last year and a half or so, I've been knitting socks. And all my socks using like standard patterns and standard sock weight yarn, they all turned out like really big. And so I kept having to go down to needle sizes. Now I'm knitting on a size 1 needle. And still I have to like reduce the number of stitches in order to get like a very, tight gauge like you're supposed to for socks so that they don't wear out. Now I'm at here, I got a yarn end here, so it's a little difficult to like figure out. It's really this bump at the front plus that little piece right there, I guess would be my bump. All right, so then now I'm gonna knit 23 more rows and then place these 12 stitches on a holder, and then I'm done with the yarn 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Okay, that's 12. Going to cut leaving 6 inches, and I'm going to put these on a holder. Okay. Okay, so that was the left. So this was the cast on. Square 1, square 2, square 3, pick up and knit, square 4, pick up and knit, or pick up and knit in that direction really, square 5. Okay, so that's the center done. The next thing is that I'm going to show you and knit with you another method for working this cross piece, or the 5 squares, that only generates 4 yarn ends. Okay, so you can see all these yarn ends, right? And I talked about this earlier in the video where I was showing you the constructions, but there's quite a few yarn ends. And all of those have to be woven in, right? There's one yarn end I didn't really have to generate, which is this one. So after I knitted the first square, I cut this yarn. I could have draped it loosely until the next use, which was up here. And then when I was doing the pick up and knit along this right edge, I could have woven in this draped yarn by inserting my needle above and below that yarn every other stitch, like alternating above, below, above, below. And that would have tacked it to the other side. So I could have reduced this to 8 yarn ends. But the other method that I'm going to show you next is going to generate a lot less yarn ends, just 4. Yeah, these are dark colors, whereas for the method 1 block, I use light colors for the inner parts. We will start out by casting on 12 stitches. Using a knitted cast on, as usual. And then, once we have 12 stitches on the needle, we will knit 22 rows. Okay, so now I'm going to knit another whole bunch of rows. And here we go. I've completed the 22 rows now, so let's see how I know that. So first off, I can count the number of ridges, and I have, there's the first one down there, and then I have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11. So 2 times 11 is 22. I've got my cast on end over here at the right bottom corner. And my working yarn is over here at the left because I just finished knitting a right side row. So now I want to turn and I'm going to bind off 11 stitches. I'm not going to bind off all the stitches. I'm going to bind off 11 stitches, and I'm going to be leaving the last stitch on the needle. My bind off should be loose because I don't want the bind off to be tight and draw in and distort the shape. Just doing a knitted bind off all the way across. Okay, now I've got 1 stitch on each needle. I'll bind off one more time. Now I've got just this 1 stitch left on the needle. Now normally where I would, tie this off, I'm not going to do that. Instead I'm just going to turn the needle, put it in my left hand, and cast on 11 stitches. So now this cast on is for square 2. So I've started it, well, I've ended square 1 without cutting the yarn, and I've started square 2 without a yarn end. So right there, I've eliminated 2 yarn ends. So once I've cast on the 12 stitches, or I'm casting on 11 for a total of 12 stitches, then I'm going to just knit 22 rows all over again for square 2. And at that point I'll just be repeating knit 22 rows, then on the next wrong side row bind off 11 stitches, leaving 1 stitch on the needle, and then turn and cast on 11 stitches again for square 3. So you just continue doing that. Now here, see how this stitch looks kind of wild, wonky, and loose? I'm just going to knit that through the back loop just to tighten it up ever so slightly. That looks a lot better already. And there's my nice little join between the squares. And just keep knitting. That was my first knit row. So this is row 3, which is my second knit row. Now I've got square 2 completed as well, but it's not quite complete. So I just want to point out that the working yarn, when we're ready to start the bind off, needs to be on this other side, but I've already got 11 ridges. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11. And I'm counting the little ridge that's right underneath the needle there. So let me just pull it up. So it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Working yarn is still on the right. So I actually need to work one more row, but since that's the first row of the new ridge that I'm starting to knit, and a ridge is 2 rows, from the right side, I don't create any new ridge feature, right? I'm just adding some space between the previous ridge, ridge 11, and the needle. So I've got, when I'm done with this row, the working yarn over on the left corner. Still have 11 ridges, and now I'm ready to start the bind off of 11 stitches. So I'm doing this just like I did for the first square, just a nice loose-ish bind off. You can use a larger needle for the right needle if you're having trouble getting an appropriate loose but consistently tensioned binding. Binding off at the right tension for the knitting that you've done is like a skill that takes some time to develop. Garter stitches are a bit wider than stockinette, so you need even a looser tension for your bind off. I really am just kind of starting with a very loose stitch for the bind off, and then I just adjust it a little bit. That's how I get it consistent. Okay, so that was my last stitch. I've got one left on the needle. I'm not going to tie it off. I'm just going to turn my needle and begin my cast on for square 3. Again, this is started just the same way that I started square 2. I'll be casting on my 11 stitches for a total of 12, 11 plus the one that I left on the needle, so that's 12. And then I'll once again knit 22 rows. 13. Let me drop one. Okay, so I'm just going to start knitting the 22 rows. This is my first wrong side row. Cast on was my right side row. So this is my number 1 knitted row of the 22, and it's a wrong side row. And I'll just continue like this, doing a whole lot of knitted rows. And again, I'm knitting the first stitch because I see it is kind of, you know, it's been pulled out a little bit. I just knit that through the back loop to kind of pull it in a little bit, make it neater. Getting to the end of my 22nd row for my 3rd square. So let's arrange all of these now. So I've got the 3 squares. See if I can get them all on the camera here. That's the first square. So I cast on in this direction, knitted 22 rows, at which point I was over at this corner, and then I bound off 11, leaving 1 stitch on the needle, turned and cast on 11 for a total of 12, knit 22 rows. Yarn was over on this corner, I bound off, left 1 stitch on the needle, turned and cast on 11 stitches for the 3rd square, and knitted 22 rows. And so again, I've got 11 ridges completed here, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11. And I've also knitted 1 additional row so that the yarn is over here on the left-hand side. That was a right side row. And now I'm going to bind off these stitches. So this is bind off for square 3. We have 1 more square to go after this. It goes quick. A very easy shape to memorize just after knitting 1 of them. Great TV knitting, car knitting, bus, train, whatever knitting. Casting off all of these except for leaving the last one on the needle. Turning and casting on 11 more for square number 4. It's the last square. Count and see how many stitches. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Okay, so now I'm going to knit 22 rows. Oh, I'm nearing the end of the 22nd row of knitting. Okay, so let's arrange all of the squares so we can see them. We started down here. Just untwist this one here. There we go. We started down here with square number 1, and then 2, 3, and 4. This one is actually twisted around a bit. Let me untwist it. Here are the 4 squares, starting with square number 1 on the left, 2, 3, 4, and I'm now at the end of square 4, having completed 11 ridges plus 1 row that was worked on the right side. All of my little connectors are on the right edges of the squares, and now I can complete this by binding off all 12 remaining stitches. Again, doing that nice and loose. And then I can cut the yarn. Notice that on this piece, I have only generated 2 yarn ends. I'm going to insert the yarn end through the loop and tie it off. And that now I've got the 4 completed squares ready to go for the next step. I've rearranged the 4 squares so they look like the picture at the left of the screen. This is square 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the 2 tails. Now in the next step, with the color that we want to use for the center, which is color B, we're going to start at the bottom right corner of square number 1, pick up and knit 12 stitches along the edge, place a marker on the needle, another 12 stitches along square 2, place a marker on the needle, another 12 stitches along the edge of square 3, and finally another 12 stitches along the edge of square 4. And then we'll be working a square to fill the middle that is worked from the outside in. Let's see how that's done. I'm going to start with square 1, bottom right corner. Let me first look at the ridges that I have available here. So this is the first one up here. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Okay, so this is my first ridge down here. I'm going to pinch the yarn in my index and third finger and draw a loop through. That looks a little messy. Let me do it again. Draw a loop through. Next stitch. Just going to go along here, picking up and knitting a stitch through the end of each ridge. I showed how to do this when we were working the cross, how to open up these little holes at the end of the ridge so that it's easy to put your needle through. And the reason we use the ridges again is because we get a better secure connection going through those 2 loops, and because we get the right number of stitches, 1 per ridge. If we go in between the ridges, we get 1 fewer than we need. There's the last ridge. It's a little strange looking, so I think I will only be able to go through 1 stitch there. Place a marker on the needle. And then continue with the next square. I'm going to have to reorient things. Should look like that for continuing. Go through the first ridge of the next square, just 1 stitch per ridge. So again, it's just 12 stitches, 1 per ridge through each of the edges of the square. You could think of these as the inner edges of the pieces, these squares that we've already worked. So I've got probably 11, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11, and I need 1 more, which I'll just get from there. Okay, make sure everything is untwisted. Again, I had this like twisted the wrong way. It probably wouldn't matter that much, but I'm gonna try to keep it untwisted. So I've got my 12 stitches along the edge of the second square, and I'm gonna continue picking up 1 stitch per ridge on square 3, using the same tension as I do for my knitting, maybe slightly tighter. I could use a crochet hook for this, of maybe 1 size smaller, like a straight shanked crochet hook that I could slide stitches off of, the blunt end. That's how I used to do it, but I now just use a knitting needle. Okay, let's count 2, 4, 6, 8, 12. Place the 3rd marker. And then 12 stitches picked up and knit along the last bit here, which is square 4. So 12 times 4 is 48 stitches. So we'll start with 48 stitches when working this center square. I can easily fit this many stitches on just a 10-inch straight needle. I usually knit most of my geometric knit shapes on a straight needle because I just think it's easier and less cumbersome for small amounts of stitches than dealing with a cable. I've got all of the stitches picked up and knitted along the inner edges, or the right-hand edge of those squares that we knitted. And I've got the 3 markers between sets of 12 stitches. My first wrong side row is just a plain knit row. This is actually row number 2 in my way of counting, because the pick up and knit that we did counts as row 1. And again, that's because it adds half of a row's length to our knitting. And again, that's because a pick up and knit is equal to 1 row of knitting in height, as is a cast on. So when I get to the markers, I just slip them. And then the last set of 12. So far we haven't done any decreases. We still have 48 stitches. Okay, this is right side row 3. And we're going to start with a knit 2 together on the first 2 stitches of the row, and then knit to 2 stitches before the next marker. And then we can slip those knitwise and together to the right needle, take off the marker, set it aside, knit a stitch, and insert the left needle left to right through the 2 stitches that we slipped. and with the yarn tensioned firmly, pass the 2 slip stitches over the knitted stitch. See that nice centered decrease right in the middle with those other 2 stitches tucked in behind. Now we'll replace the marker on the needle after the CDD, and we'll do the same thing at the next marker. We'll knit 2 stitches before the next marker. Slip the next 2 stitches, and that's the 2 stitches before the marker, by inserting our right needle left to right through both stitches. Slip them together off to the right needle, remove that marker, knit the next stitch. Now insert the left needle left to right through the front legs of the 2 slip stitches, and with yarn tensioned firmly so that this stitch that we knitted doesn't fall off the needle, pull the 2 slip stitches over. And then replace the marker and keep it going. So we're going to do the same thing around the 3rd marker. Knit 2 stitches before the marker. Slip 2 stitches knitwise and together to the right needle. Drop the marker. Knit a stitch. Insert left to right through the 2 slipped stitches on the right needle. Tension and pull those over, and then replace the marker. Now we're going to knit 2 stitches before the end of the row. And we're going to do an SSK, slip, slip, knit 2 together. So that's slip a stitch, knitwise to the right needle, slip the next stitch, knitwise to the right needle, insert the left needle through the front legs, left to right, so that the left needle is crossing in front of the right needle, and then yarn around the right needle, and then pull that loop through and onto the right needle. Okay. Now we should count every time we finish a right side decreasing row. And we started out with 48 stitches, so that was 12 stitches between each marker. We should now have 10. So I'll just do a quick count to see if we do. Yes. Now if we didn't, rather than frogging this, I might just make a increase or a decrease on the very next row. If I make that alteration and fix very quickly, like on the next row, then it's not going to affect the shape. And in garter stitch, a backwards loop increase or a knit 2 together doesn't show much. The key is to count frequently. Every time you work a row that has a stitch increase or decrease, just check and make sure that you haven't added or something that you didn't mean to, or yeah, just make sure that you've got the correct number of stitches. So we're just going to continue in this alternating rows that we established. This shape will work quickly because we'll be decreasing 8 stitches on each right side row, and that'll make it go very quick. Before we know it, we'll be at the center. Okay, So again, we finished the wrong side row, number 4, and we're now on rows 5. So for rows 5, 7, 9, 11, all of which are right side rows, we'll just be repeating row 3, which was the knit 2 together on the first 2 stitches, knit to 2 stitches before the marker, and then work a CDD. Oh, it sounds like my friend the cat has woken up. Usually she sleeps through the entire evening, but I think my talking has made her wakeful. And then another CDD, started 2 stitches before the next marker. Place the marker after the CDD. Worked 2 stitches before the next marker. CDD, place marker. And then work to the last 2 stitches and do an SSK. We start out the row with the knit 2 together, and then we use the matching decrease, which is the SSK at the end of the row. Now this doesn't matter that much in garter stitch, but it's still nice to observe the conventions, even though the stitch maneuvers don't show that much in garter stitch, which is kind of a nice thing. So wrong side row number 6 will be also a knit row, as are all wrong side rows. I don't know if I mentioned this before in the video, but this yarn is Sugar Bush, which is a now defunct yarn company, went out of business during COVID. Beautiful yarn though. It was not cheap, but it was worth every penny. Okay, we're on a right side row again. So again, it's knit 2 together. They're all the same. Knit to 2 stitches before the marker. Whoops, just dropped that stitch. Do a CDD. Place the marker. It's always exciting to see the shape coming together like this as I'm knitting to the center. What's it going to look like? Okay. CDD, started 2 stitches before the marker. Place marker. Do a CDD. You can kind of see the line of CDDs getting established here. They're stacked right one on top of another. The middle stitch of the CDD is oriented in a straight vertical line because they're stacked right on top of each other. Sometimes once they're established like this, I can see them well enough that I take off the markers because I don't really need them to see where the CDD should be worked. With a little bit of experience, I'm sure that will be the case for you as well. Wrong side row 8, plain knitting. After cautioning you about counting, I then did not count on the last right side row I did. So let me count on this one. Okay. I have 6 stitches between each pair of markers and between the last markers and the ends. So again, I'm on a right side row, so I'm going to continue working my decreases, which are getting closer and closer together. I'm just going to leave my markers off now, and I'll try to show you on the next row where I'm going to make the decreases. Again, we're 2 stitches before the marker. I'm not putting them back on. I'm going to live dangerously. Knit to 2 stitches before the end of the row and SSK for our edge decrease. Okay, wrong side row, plain knitting. Okay, so this is right side row 11, and I know that because I've completed 5 ridges, counting from where the pick up and knit was, where the color change was. So, okay, so this is another decrease row. So knit 2 together, and then I'm going to take a look at the knitting, and I can see where the last CDD was done, right? It was done on this column of stitches right here. So a CDD is done on the 3 stitches, that are centered. There's 2 on either side centered around this column of stitches in the middle. So I know this is where I do the CDD. And I'm going to put my markers back on. I just want to show you how I identify where to do the CDD when there is no marker. Now I look ahead, there's the CDD, there's the stitch before the CDD, so I only need to work 1 stitch as knit, and now I'm going right into the CDD. And again, I'll put my marker back on now. Knit 1. Now I've got 1 stitch before the column where the CDD is centered. So I'll slip those 2, knit 1, doing a CDD over those 3 stitches, knit 1, SSK. Okay. I guess I forgot to put that marker on. Okay, so I've now got, I just want to show you what it looks like when you're done. Let me put the marker back on. So we've got these 3 markers. We've got 2 stitches between the markers, and we've got 2 stitches from the first marker to the beginning of the row and from the 3rd marker to the end of the row. We're going to knit 1 more row, and then we really can drop the markers permanently. I only put them back on just to show you what the count looks like at the end. So this is the last row that we're knitting. Taking a look at our knitting, which is all kind of scrunched and crazy looking, we've got 6 completed ridges, which makes sense, right? Because these blocks are based on 12 stitches, 12 ridges, and we can see that we've got 6 ridges going to the middle, so we've got another 6 ridges approaching the middle from this side. So that count definitely makes sense. So now we can cut the yarn, but the question is how much yarn to leave. See, but there's going to be an open seam right here that we need to sew. So I need to leave a little bit of extra so I can sew that. So let me leave maybe 12 inches instead of the normal 6 that I leave, and see if that's going to be enough to sew. So I'm going to start by taking a tapestry needle and threading the remaining yarn end onto the tapestry needle. I'm inserting the tapestry needle through the live stitches that are still left on the needle. And I can just pull that through all the way. And it makes kind of a nice little rosette in the middle. Now for security, I usually, once it's off the needle, I insert my tapestry needle again through all of those stitches. Actually, I think this is the first stitch way over here. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There we go. So that's the second time through. And that just makes it a little bit more secure. I feel if I pull now, nothing's gonna break or anything in there. So now I've got this open seam and I want to sew it closed. And I'm going to use mattress stitch. With mattress stitch, you work on the right side of your work so you can see what you're doing and adjust if necessary. My yarn is coming out over here on this edge over here. So the first stitch I'm going to make is across from that. So I'm going to locate the ridge. This is the last ridge I knitted right here. So I'm going to locate the end stitch, which is right there of that ridge, and insert my needle through just that little stitch that's poking up on top of that ridge, and then go back to the other side and insert my needle through the stitch on the other end of the ridge. Same ridge. Now I've completed that ridge, and I can go down to the next stitch, or the next ridge, sorry. I can go down to the next ridge, and I can insert my needle through this little stitch right at the end of the ridge. Pull it through. I don't want to pull it taut because I want this yarn to kind of undulate back and forth. Now I'm going to go across, and identify the same ridge on the other side and put my needle through that. And then I'm going to go back to this side, put my needle through the edge stitch on the next ridge. Now here I have something I don't like, which is a little bit of a gap. So I'm going to unthread my needle, go back a couple stitches. So this is the beauty of doing it on a right side row, because you can see what it's going to look like. There's no blind sewing involved here. You can see exactly what it's going to look like. Okay, so here, when I came through this, let me redo, I'll come through this stitch. Now, if I'm concerned that there's a hole there, or that won't tighten up properly, I can repeat this stitch by going back to the opposite side, pushing my needle up, whereas it came down originally, and then bring it around again and back through that stitch. So I'm kind of reversing and going back through that stitch to redo it, to tighten it up. And then I can continue. And again, if there's any other area where I feel like, you know, there's kind of a hole or I don't really like the way it looks, I can just go around, back up the other side, and then back down again. So I'm going across to the next ridge, down that stitch, crossing again to this edge, down the stitch, the ridge, the stitch at the end of the ridge on the other side. Because of the decreases that we did on the end of these rows, it's not as easy to see which little strand to put the needle through as it would be if there had not been a decrease there. Okay, so I'll go through the last ridge. So what we're trying to do here is match up all the ridges with our sewing, make the sewing match the tension of the knitting. And again, if we see any little holes forming, we can always go, you know, across to the side, the opposite side, up, and then back down. In fact, I often do that at the end of my mattress stitch. So I've got another yarn end from where I started to pick up a knit of this color, and so I can tie these two together. This is the only tying I've done so far. And then I would weave these in. I can also tie these two together. These are the cast on and the bind off ends of my A color. Don't really need to, but why not? I don't really like to see a lot of knots in my work, but yeah. So there we have it. That is the method 2 cross. In the final block, it's going to be oriented that way. It's only got 4 ends to weave in. You can see on the back, just these 4 ends as compared to 10 for method 1. And we didn't have to go through a lot more trouble. We just had to sew that little seam with mattress stitch. Otherwise, I think it was equivalent in terms of difficulty. We have now finished knitting the cross and we're ready to move on to the outer shapes. With my color C, I'm going to pick up and knit 12 stitches along one of these arms of the cross. It doesn't matter which one I start with. I'm going to do it exactly the same for all of them. So I'm going to start by picking up and knitting. I don't tie it on, I'm just tensioning it at the back of the work. And 1 stitch per ridge I'll pick up along this edge, inserting through the knot at the end of each ridge, like I have on the previous pieces. Oops, picked up an extra little strand there. It's always difficult on a bind off or a decrease to know exactly where to insert, but you do the best you can. So let's count 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. I've got 12 stitches, so I've got the right number to proceed. On my first wrong side row, which is row 2, I need to do 2 adjustment increases so that I can get up to 14 stitches. It would have been difficult to pick up 14 stitches and make it look nice along those 12 ridges, so it's easier to adjust to 14 on the next row. So I'm going to do a backwards loop increase after knitting 4 stitches. So I'm going to wrap the yarn around my index finger, left index finger, and then with the right needle sweep it through that front leg and onto the right needle. And then I'm going to knit 4 more stitches and do another BLI increase, backwards loop increase. Wrap it around my left finger with right needle sweep right to left onto the needle, and then knit to the end. Now the trick is on the next row not to accidentally drop those BLI stitches, so I'm going to have to be careful that I don't let them just drop off the needle, which they might do if I wasn't paying attention. So now the next row is row 3, so it says knit front and back. So this has an edge increase, and then knit across to the end, making sure not to drop the BLI stitch, which is this one. There's my next BLI stitch. Take a little extra care inserting my needle. And then I'm at the end, and I'm going to work another knit front and back for a second edge. Now on the wrong side, I'm just going to knit. So on the next 10 rows or 5 ridges, I'm just going to be repeating rows 3 and 4. And so that again is on right side rows. There'll be a knit front and back on the first stitch and the last stitch of the row, and wrong side rows will be plain knitting. I'm just finishing up row 12, which is a wrong side plain knit row. And I should have 24 stitches, which I've already counted, and I do. So I know that this is row 12 because I have 6 completed ridges. I've just completed a wrong side row. I'm on a right side row. I know that because I have a clean color change here. Also, my yarn end that I attached is right here, also on the right hand side. This is the reason that I number the pick up and knit and any stitch generation as row number 1 so that this easy math can be done, which is simply the number of ridges times 2 is the row number that you've just completed when you're looking at starting a new right side row. So here the number of ridges is 6. 6 times 2 is 12. So I know that I've completed up through row 12, and I'm ready to start my next right side row, which is an odd numbered row. We'll now start doing the decreases on right side rows. We'll make a knit 2 together at the beginning of the row over the first 2 stitches, then knit all the way to the last 2 stitches. And then work an SSK, which is the paired decrease, over the last 2 stitches. Again, all wrong side rows are plain knitted. And then all right side rows will work what we just did, which was knit 2 together, knit to the last 2 stitches, SSK. So we'll continue until we have 2 stitches remaining after completing a right side row. I've got 4 stitches left and I'm about to start the last right side row, so it's knit 2 together, and then there's no knit stitches in between. Then I immediately do the SSK. And then I turn and work the last right side row, which is just a knit 2 together. And now I can cut the yarn, leaving about 6 inches for weaving. Enlarge my loop and insert the tail through, tighten. So that's the first one done, first corner. So that's the first corner done, and now I have these other 3 corners to work in exactly the same way, starting with the pick up and knit. First row is an increase row up to 14 stitches, and then working the double increases to 24 stitches, and then on the next right side row starting the double decreases down to 2 stitches. And I just continue doing that on the other 3 arms of this cross. Here's the block with all of those corners added, and you can see the yarn ends hanging out. They haven't been woven in yet. The next step is to pick up and knit around the edges between each pair of arms and then work the corner shapes. Take you in to look a little closer. It doesn't matter which of the house-shaped spaces you start with, just pick one. I'm going to start by turning the work so it's more conveniently facing me and looking at the area where I want to pick up the first 8 stitches. I'm going to be inserting my needle in the ridges that I have available and then using some of the leg strands between ridges. So it looks like the proper cadence here would be something like ridge, ridge, and then that leg in between, ridge, ridge, leg in between, ridge, ridge. And that would get me 8 stitches. So let me do that. I'm working on the right side always for pick up and knit. Leave about 6 inches of yarn for weaving in. So I'll do ridge and then ridge. So it's just those 2 twisty pieces. We've looked at that in several other videos, or we've looked at that in several other pieces of this video. I'll do the leg, this leg, in between the last ridge that I just picked up in, which is that one, and the next ridge that I haven't picked up in yet. So I'll insert through just the leg, yarn around, pull a loop through, and then the next 2 ridges. And then the next leg right after the last ridge I picked up in, and then the next 2 ridges, or the last 2 ridges. And that should be 8 stitches. Perfect. The general cadence for picking up on this 45-degree type of edge is to do ridge, ridge, leg, ridge, ridge, leg, ridge, ridge, just like we did. And so I'm going to be making the same types of decreases at the same rate around both marker 1 and 3. So I'm going to use the same colors for marker 1 and 3. That helps me remember what I'm doing. The next edge, I will be wanting to pick up 12 stitches. And what I have here is a bind off loops to do that in. So if I take a look at this, let's see how many I have. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 readily available. So let me look at where I can do that. So I can get an extra stitch right here on the end, and then I can pick up in this little area between this bind off and this bind off. So I'll do my 12th stitch over there. Okay, so I'll start out right here in just this little area, pull one through. I'm going to be going through both loops of the bind off. That's again to make it secure so that it, doesn't pull and create a loose stitch. If I just went through one strand, it would tend to, pull out and distort if it was under any particular tension. So since this is a bind off, generally the rate is 1 stitch per bound off stitch. But again, I'm a little bit short because I've used those stitches for pickup and knits. So my 12, I've got 11, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11, and my 12th stitch will be here, which is that loop, which is right in between the two squares that were done in the A color. And now I'll put my other color stitch marker on. I'll use a yellow. So there's 12 stitches, then marker 2, which I'm using a yellow, and then maybe I should plan out my next one. Let's look at what loops I've got. I've already used that loop. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. That would be 11, and then maybe I'll use this area right here for 12. It's always good to take a look so you don't have any surprises. Plan things out. Once I do this one block, then I won't have to do so much planning. I'll remember what I did on the previous block and I can just do that. That should be 11 right there. Let me count. Yes, that's 11. And then I'll get my 12th stitch right from there. Then I will put another green marker on. That's marker 3. And then I will go back to picking up stitches on the short diagonal end, and I need 8 there. So I'll use that cadence I was using before, which is ridge, ridge, or bump, bump, strand or leg, and then next ridge, strand or leg, ridge, and ridge, for a total of 8 stitches. So this pick up and knit counts as row 1, or we're counting it as row 1. And row 2 will be just plain knitting. Now if I was off a little on the pick up and knit, I would make an adjustment using a backwards loop increase or a knit 2 together, depending on whether I wanted an increase or a decrease on this next row. But for us, since we managed to get the right number of stitches, we'll just knit this row, slipping markers as encountered. If I put them towards me, that would be much better because then the loop doesn't, my yarn doesn't have to try to stretch around them. It's an unruly ball of yarn I've got. slip markers as I encounter them. I only learned recently from a friend about how to find the strand end on a center pole ball that you're supposed to stick your index fingers in from each end of the skein and kind of twiggle them around inside, like twirl them around each other inside, and that magically that loose strand will get entangled with one of your fingers. So I've been practicing that, but these are older balls of yarn I'm using from old sample knits, and so I didn't manage to find the center pole strand, and so they were pulled from the outside in, so they're not very well behaved. But that trick that I learned, it doesn't always work, unfortunately, but it sometimes works. It's worth trying. Okay, that was the first wrong side row. Now this is row 3. So in row 3, we're gonna get right past the first marker, marker 1, and go to 2 stitches before the second marker. And then around the second marker, once we're 2 stitches in front of it, like I am here, we do a CDD. We slip the next 2 stitches knitwise to the right needle, drop the marker, knit 1 stitch, and then inserting the left needle through the front 2 strands, left to right, and tensioning the stitch that's on the right needle, we pass those 2 slip stitches over. And then we replace marker 2 on the right needle and keep going. And in this case, keep going is to knit right past marker 3, ignoring it, and go to the end of the row. In my patterns, if I had to say to slip every marker that you come to, the pattern would probably be twice as long. So I always have a note in the pattern saying, if you encounter a marker and the pattern doesn't say to do anything, just slip it. It's going to be used later, so it needs to be there. So all wrong side rows for now are just plain knitting. That's true with a lot of my patterns. All the increases, decreases, and special stitch maneuvers are done on right side rows. So the wrong side row is when you can catch up on your text messages, try to figure out what's going on with your TV show, answer questions from the children, etc. No thinking required. It would be better if I swung these markers towards me, as I mentioned, but I could also use just a regular non-locking stitch marker for this shape, because I don't have to actually unlock these stitch markers. They just get, dropped and moved around without having to unlock them. That might be a little easier. Okay, so this next row is a right side row. It's row number 5. And in this row, we make decreases around all 3 markers. So we're going to start by knitting to 2 stitches before the first green marker. And here we're going to do an SSK, which is slip, slip, knit through the back loop, slip the marker, and then knit 2 together on the 2 stitches after the marker. Then we'll go up to marker 2, will do our regular old CDD. See if I can just pick it up. There we go. And then knit to the next marker, which is marker 3. And again, it's marked green so that it matches marker 1 because we do the same type of decrease around it on the same rows. Whereas around the yellow marker, marker 2, we're doing something different. So this one we're doing SSK, whoops, didn't mean to drop it that far. Okay, and then knit 2 together. And then we knit to the end of the row. So on this row, row 5, we decreased 6 stitches, whereas on row 3, when we just made the CDD around marker 2, we decreased 2 stitches. So we're working from the outside in on this shape, decreasing as we go to form the shape properly. On this row, again, it's just wrong side plain knitting. I tend to work all of my blocks like this on a straight needle, like a 10-inch needle, because I find that for me personally, a cable is always in my way. I'll use a cable when I need to accommodate a large number of stitches, but I kind of like the simplicity of working on my straight needles. I have like, I don't know how many pairs in size 7 that are 10 inches. I'm fortunate that a lot of people that I know that I knit, and they give me a lot of their older equipment. So I have many pairs of needles in every size and every length and every kind of material. Not too many modern ones. Okay, so there we have 3 ridges complete, and that means we've just finished row 6 because we're ready to start another right side row. We've got those 3 ridges. So 3 times 2, because there's 2 rows of knitting per ridge, gives us 6. Okay, so a row 7, which is a right side row, is just a repeat of row 3. So that's where we breeze right on by marker 1, just slipping it. And then we come to a stop 2 stitches before marker 2, which is right there. And then we do the CDD, dropping the marker. The CDD stitch is the one that's used in the middle of a V-neck of the ribbing or the collar part to make a nice little stitch that stands up straight in the center. Okay, so we're going to breeze on right by marker 3. So again, this is a row where we're going to make 2 decreases total, just that CDD, or 2 stitches decreased. Not 2 decreases, but 2 stitches decreased. Knit to the end. So I'm always advising others to do some counting, so maybe I should do that. So the relationship between the stitches should stay the same here. So I started out with 8 stitches, and so the 2 areas from the green markers to the ends, they should equal each other. So let's see if that's true here. Oops, I've got that pulled a little tight. So we've got 7 stitches here and 7 stitches here, so they do equal. I started out with 1 stitch more here than here, so I should still have 1 stitch more. I have 8, and I have 8. Oops, let me count that again. Maybe I did something wrong. Oh, oops. that's a problem. I do now recall that instead of picking up 11 stitches in this area, I picked up 12. I wonder if you caught my mistake when I did that. I'm not going to worry about this too much. I'm just going to make a decrease in this area on the next row because I know that this area should be 1 stitch less than this, and I know I forgot about making a pick up a knit that was 1 stitch less there. Okay, so I can fix that. Oftentimes, to remind myself that I need to fix something, I'll put a marker around the 2 stitches that I want to decrease over. So that way when I get to it, I'll remember. It's surprising how often I can forget to do something like that. Plus, if you put your knitting down and come back tomorrow, you'll definitely forget. I'm not going to worry about the shape being way off. I don't think it's going to be. That extra stitch is not going to be a problem. There I go. I'm knitting those 2 together. I saw my reminder marker. I can take that off. Now I've got the right number. And after this row, I'll also recount and I'll compare it with my pattern stitch to just check it against that. I was just showing you a quick and easy way to count the stitches using the relationships that you established between the stitch numbers of the different sections when you generated those stitches during the pick up and knit. That's often a good way just to get a general idea of whether those stitches are correct, and then to do a more thorough count once you realize they're wrong. Okay, so I've just finished row 8, and my stitch counts say that I should have 7, then 8, then 7, then 7. So let's see how we're doing with that. So this has 7, this has 8, this has 7, and this has 7. Okay, so we're back in business. Row 9 is a repeat of row 5, and row 5 was where we did decreases around each pair of marker. We'll do an SSK around the green markers, markers 1 and 3. And then, of course, a knit 2 together after the marker. Go down here to marker 2 and do a CDD. Replacing the marker after the CDD, and then knitting to 2 stitches before marker 3, SSK, slit marker, knit 2 together, and then knit to the end. Pretty sure I didn't do anything wrong there, but because I made a mistake before, I will count. So after this row, I should have 6, 6, 5, and 6. Let's see, 6, 6, yes, 5, and 6, yay. Wrong side, row 10. It's just plain knitting. Slipping markers as we go. Now for the other house-like shapes that are worked between these arms, you're going to work them just the same as this one. Okay. So let's see, we've got 5 ridges completed. 5 times 2 is 10. So that means we've completed row 10. and we're ready for row 11, which is a repeat of row 3, which is to knit to marker 2 and do a CDD at marker 2. Things will start to go a little faster as you get to fewer stitches, of course. I find that after making a couple of these shapes, I've pretty much memorized it, which is one of the nice things about this style of knitting, is that you don't have to keep referring back to directions because the shapes are easily memorized. Maybe the first time you go through it, it's like a little baffling how it's all going to work out, but very quickly you come to understand it. And then you don't have any problems, and it's, you don't have to refer back to charts or pattern stitches, except for occasionally. And this is wrong side row number 12. Just plain knitting. There's only, I think, 18 rows in this entire shape. Okay. So we've completed 12 rows, and I know that because I've got 6 ridges, and 6 times 2 is 12, and I'm looking at a right side row. So that's row 13. And I'm going to repeat row 5, which is to do decreases around all the markers. Maybe I should count after this row. Oops, I did that wrong. For CDD, slip 2 stitches knitwise. Drop. Knit 1. Pass 2 slip stitches over. Well, tensioning. That tensioning is important so that that stitch doesn't fall off the needle end as you're trying to pass the other 2 over. Okay, I'm already at this next one, so slip, slip, knit through back loops. Knit 2 together, and we're down at the end. So after row 13, I should have 5, 3, 2, and 5, counting from the right side. So we'll check that that's the case before proceeding. Again, I could make corrections if that's not the case. So 5, 3, 2, 5. Perfect. 14. Oh, after 13, it says that I can remove marker 1 and marker 3. I will do that. I'll still call this one marker 2, though, even though there's only 1 marker left. So again, this is a wrong side row, so I'm knitting it. So the next 2 right side rows, I'm going to be repeating row 3, which is where I just make a decrease around marker 2. So we will do that. CDD. And after this row, I should have how many stitches? 13 stitches. Let's see about that. 2, 4, 6, 7, 9, 11, 13. Yes. Okay, wrong side rows. This is row 14, plain knitting. We're getting so close to a very exciting point of a 3-needle bind off. Woohoo! This is another repeat of row 3. This is row 17. I can remove the marker now. I don't have to put it back on because I'm done making CDDs. Okay. So now I'm going to, on the next wrong side row, I'm going to do a setup for the 3-needle bind off. I need even numbers of stitches to do a 3-needle bind off, and right now I have 11 stitches. So I'm going to be knitting the first 4 stitches, then knit 2 together, so that I have 5 stitches on both the right and the left needle. So let me do that. 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches knit, and then knit the next 2 together. Let me do that so I don't have a little strand caught in there. Okay, I've got 5 stitches on each needle. Now I'm going to rotate my back needle while trying to pull out this yarn to the right. My working yarn should be between the needles and off to the right, not stuck there in the middle. And I've rotated them so that the right sides of my work are together and the wrong sides are out. You can see the interleaved color change there, indicating the wrong side. And I like to use a larger needle for my 3-needle bind off. I bring my 2 needle tips parallel, and I like to also work at the end so that I have more room here in the stitches. If I work back here, it's nice and safe and I don't feel like they're going to fall off, but I'm going to have a hard time, you know, because there's not much room to insert a needle or to pull a stitch through. So that's why I like to do it at the tip. And then I bring up my left index finger to help me keep everything on the needle like it should be. And I try to keep these needles nice and parallel during the whole process, which usually requires some adjustments. Okay, so I start out by inserting the large 3rd needle through the front stitch and the back stitch. The first ones on each needle knitwise. And then I yarn around just like I'm knitting, but I pull through both stitches on both needles. And then I pull it off. They're caught, they're fine. And then I do the same thing with the next 2 stitches that are presenting themselves. Again, adjusting these needles so they're parallel and the tips are even. And then I yarn around and I bring another loop through. And I also drop those off onto the right needle. And then using the back needle, I insert it left to right through the front strand of the rightmost stitch, and I pull it over the leftmost stitch. Now I've just bound off one. So I now have to load up the right needle again to do the next bind off. So I insert again through the front stitch, the back stitch, making sure I'm working at the end, using my left index finger if I need to keep things on the needle if they are tending to fall off. And then I yarn around the big needle, pull through a loop, pull it off, and then insert the back of the 2 left needles and pull a stitch over. I like to keep that nice and loose, the tension here, so that that line of chaining doesn't pull in or distort the shape that I've just knitted. If I do it tight, it's going to draw it in and it's not going to look like it's supposed to. Okay, so I'm just doing the next pair of stitches. Now I've just got 2 left, so they're wanting to fall off the needle, of course, so I have to keep an eye on that. See my nice little row of chaining that's been created there? And then the last 2 stitches are just worked in the same way. Again, my unruly, slippery left needles are wanting to fall out. Pull a loop through, and then pull that over on the right needle. Now I've just got this loop here, which I can now cut the yarn end, leaving about 6 inches. If I was going to sew a seam here, I'd leave more, but I don't have any particular plan like that for this block. So there is my completed house shape. So if I turn it over, you can see that it looks a little bit like a house. So there's a little bit of a gap here, but when I sew it together with the block next door, or if I picked up and knit it along this edge, it would draw it in and close it. So I don't worry about that. Here's the finished block after I added the 3 remaining houses. Let me turn over so you can see the back. Here's what it looks like in a mock-up of the blanket. You can go to my website, thenitwit.org/Chris-Cross, and you'll find the coloring page and the written instructions for this block. I'll be adding other resources as needed. I'm so glad that you were able to join me for this design and knit project. Please subscribe to my channel and set your notifications bell so you'll find out when I publish something new. I also just started a Patreon, and you can become a charter member for just $1 a month. As I'm finishing up this video, it just happens to be December 3rd, 2024, which is the same day that my new book, Margaret Holzmann's Iconic Blankets and More, is published. This book was a long time in the making, and I'm so glad that it is on offer at last. Go to my website and look under books, and you'll find out ways to order the book depending on where you live. Happy knitting, everyone.